That's great. I think we can, Cobus, we can go to you, I think. Cobus,
Yes, Nicola, I'm in.
the screen is yours.
Is my screen visible and am I audible?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. Before I start, I think I'd like to wish the South African Reserve Bank a very happy birthday. Today marks 100 years since the bank opened for business, 30th of June 1921, sorry. So I want to wish the bank and all its people the very best for the next 100 years. Happy birthday, everybody. Now, today I would like to share some of my thoughts on monetary financing of government spending with the focus on the South African economy. I'm presenting a paper in progress where I try to apply a quantitative dimension to a topic which is often shrouded in ideological or controversial terms. So I would really welcome any feedback and critique. I cannot possibly hope to exhaust this topic in 40 minutes, but I do hope to touch on some important points to carry the discussion forward. So just some background. Even before COVID hit, the South African economy was in trouble. Economic growth had been pedestrian. In the decade since the financial crisis, the highest growth rate we achieved was 3.3% in 2011. And since then, our growth has averaged about 1.3% per year. There were and still are serious questions about the stability and security of our electricity supply. The unemployment rate reached 29% in the second quarter of 2019, before COVID, and it currently stands at 32.6%, according to the latest figures from Stats SA. Government debt had steadily risen, and questions were being asked about our fiscal strength, to the point where our credit ratings were downgraded to junk status during 2019 and early 2020. So our economy was already under severe pressure coming into 2020, and then COVID brutally exposed the cracks. The government scrambled for funds and ways to save both lives and livelihoods. Now, the monetary policy response was swift and drastic. The repo rate was cut from 6.5% in early 2020 to 3.5% by July of 2020. And this is now the lowest it has been since the 1973 oil crisis. The SARB also bought government bonds in the secondary market to improve liquidity and market functioning, and many other central banks have done the same. The fiscal response was, however, compromised by high existing debt levels and the stagnant economy I referred to earlier, and a small and shrinking tax base. At the end of 2019, debt stood at 62% of GDP, so that's government debt, and it has since ballooned to 80%, and it is projected to go much higher. Debt servicing costs have also been rising, and that's something that was discussed yesterday and the day before, to the point where 13% of government spending is on interest payments alone. And according to Treasury's forecast, this is expected to rise to 18% by 2023-24. So Keynesian countercyclical demand management would have seen aggressive fiscal spending to counteract the downturn. Unfortunately, I fear unproductive government spending over the past 10 years have eroded our fiscal space and have left Treasury with precious little room to maneuver. Now, the lack of fiscal space increased the pressure on and expectations of the monetary policy response. But we have to pause here for a second and consider one of the important elements of contemporary central banking, which is the conviction that the power to spend money should be separated from the power to create money. And I'm paraphrasing Tito Mboweni from a speech he did, I think it was in 2000, when he was still governor of the Reserve Bank, and he is now the finance minister. So he's probably the one best suited to understand this interaction between spending money and creating money. So in other words, central banks should not really finance or subsidize government spending. This would risk conflating the central bank's price stability goal with inflationary goals, such as money creation or ultra-loose interest rates. And if the central bank starts losing its credibility, that is, if agents stop believing that the central bank is serious about containing inflation, the nominal anchor would slip and inflation expectations would rise. The central bank would then find it even harder to contain inflation. Tighter policies will be required to achieve the same comparable reduction in inflation than before, leading to a higher sacrifice ratio. And then credibility is further eroded in a downward spiral. Rather than even consider such a slippery slope, the conservative position is that central banks should remain aloof of politics and concentrate on their price stability mandate only. And I think this is a very important consideration in the South African context. Keeping inflation in check is critical in an economy with widespread unemployment, poverty, and inequality. The poor are unable to hedge against inflation. They are often dependent on nominal income, such as social grants or a daily wage, if they are fortunate enough to earn an income at all. So the socioeconomic cost of even marginally higher inflation on these literally millions of citizens would be extremely high in terms of losses in their purchasing power and further reductions in their living standards, which in turn would then again exacerbate inequality. But issues like jobs and inequality are seemingly also starting to fall on the central bank, not even in South Africa, but around the world. It's often argued nowadays that central banks should broaden their mandates to explicitly include considerations such as employment creation, social equity, and socioeconomic transformation. COVID then essentially basically created the perfect storm. Enter modern monetary theory and monetary financing, or as some would call it, magic money. Monetary financing, which I will take as meaning the financing of government spending by money creation, has always been a bit of a taboo. It's also referred to as debt monetization, or Friedman's famous helicopter money. Following the global financial crisis, economists have started thinking about what other tools central banks have at their disposal. Influential monetary economists such as Willem Buiter and Jordi Gali have, well before the COVID crisis, started writing about the possibilities around helicopter money, where some form of fiscal stimulus is financed by money creation. But never before has the question been asked within the context of a global pandemic. Moreover, the rise of MMT and the publishing of Stephanie Kelton's best-selling book, Just as the Pandemic Hit last year, has really thrust the debate into the limelight. One of the core tenets of MMT, and I'm no expert on the field, so I'm just saying what I know, or my interpretation of these arguments. One of the core tenets of MMT is that as long as there is slack in the economy, fiscal spending can be financed by fiat money creation without risking inflation. Now, this is, of course, politically very, very appealing, including here in South Africa, where to many, a 30-odd% unemployment rate is proof of massive slack in the economy. In fact, what could be more appealing than the idea of free money in the midst of a pandemic? And a selective reading of the MMT literature which suggests that governments don't need to worry about debt, but only under certain conditions, which are often not mentioned. So there's a massive political demand for new sources of funding. And it's also true that there's a great exigency for alternative monetary policy tools. So perhaps the stars are finally aligned to warrant a more serious examination of this formerly taboo topic. Economically, monetary financing could perhaps work, and I'll try to demonstrate this below in line with recent literature on the topic. The policymaker is essentially trading off higher debt against higher inflation. Therefore, if inflation is stubbornly low or an economy is facing deflation, monetary financing might be a feasible strategy. Ben Bernanke even suggested a similar strategy for Japan as far back as 2003. Politically, however, the waters are murky, and the topic raises more questions than answers. There is, of course, a great deal of political risk that monetary financing will be used to excess. Can Pandora's box be closed, once it's been opened? Is monetary discipline not the natural counterpoint to fiscal exuberance? And is this not exactly why politicians the world over have outsourced control over money to mostly independent central banks? Is there the political will to build in automatic stabilizers, which might sometime lead to contractionary policy? By this, I mean that unwinding these positions would shrink the money supply or require excess reserves to be soaked up with taxes from time to time. If central banks are politically unpopular right now, just imagine when they have to take away the magic money punch bowl, just as the party is warming up. But let's leave politics aside for the moment and try to consider the economics. I will now move to evaluating the effect of a fiscal stimulus under two different financing regimes, debt financing and monetary financing. For this, I'm going to utilize a small closed economy DSGE model developed by Jordi Gali, published in the Journal of Monetary Economics last year. I should point out that this paper was already an NBER working paper, so Ghali's thoughts precede the COVID pandemic. Ghali simulates various scenarios of tax cuts and additional government spending as two different fiscal stimuli, both with and without a zero lower bound. I'm going to be concentrating on an increase in government spending, where a zero lower bound is not binding. A similar way in which the problem can be approached, closer in spirit, I guess, to Friedman's helicopter drop, is a tax cut financed by money creation. But in the context of emergency government spending to fight the pandemic, I want to focus on the former. I'm not going to spend time deriving the model. The detail is in the paper, and anyone interested is welcome to contact me afterwards or just read Ghali's paper. The model is very simple. Its purpose is certainly not to offer a rigorous quantitative analysis, but rather to act as a storytelling device, which I think is a useful way in which to frame some of these considerations, and from which we could potentially derive or support some stylized facts on the two financing regimes. The model is a simple closed economy DSGE model with money in the household utility function and nominal rigidities in the form of staggered pricing. Household and firm blocks are standard. I assume a consolidated government sector consisting of the fiscal and monetary authorities working in full coordination. I then simulate an exogenous shock to government spending, which is the fiscal stimulus, which can be financed under one of the two financing regimes. Under the benchmark specification, the stimulus is financed through bond issuance by the fiscal authority, while the monetary authority or the central bank targets inflation through a standard Taylor rule. Under the alternative regime, the spending is financed through money creation by the central bank. Under this regime, the monetary policy reaction function changes from the Taylor rule to a money growth to ensure sufficient money creation to cover the additional government spending. This relieves the fiscus from issuing bonds or raising taxes, but it implies that the central bank is giving up control over inflation.
Yeah, just a clarifying question. So in the regime where the central bank is financing the government expenditure is the direct financing. It just transfer the money to the government. When you take the consolidating budget, so it's one-to-one to make sure as it's not going through the bond market.
Yes, you're exactly right.
Okay, and then in that regime also the central bank is not concerned about any inflation objective.
That's correct as well. I'll show you show the equations just now.
Okay, maybe the last clarified question. Is there anything in the model that tells us over time how the government, the central bank shift from one regime to another one? Is that anything in the model, or you just consider the model just with one wave of financing and then you consider another way of financing?
Yes, the latter. So I'm essentially simulating the two financing regimes separately.
Okay.
There's no regime switching in the model.
Because that would be potentially interesting, I think, to see over time whether you have, because you want to motivate, right? That will be one way to motivate your study to say, look, over time, there is a relevance of this, that the central bank or something potentially is happening. And then to tell us possibly how the regime have been empirically relevant, and then to experiment your analysis.
Yeah, that could be a very interesting application. Thank you for pointing that out, Romain. Okay, let me quickly look at some of the model equations. These are the interesting ones, the next two slides. The model is very simplistic in the sense that only one period bonds are included. Excuse me. Bonds issued, B, is a positive function of outstanding bonds from the previous period, the real interest rate and government spending, and a negative function of tax income and money creation. The parameter chi represents the inverse of the steady state income elasticity of money, and rho is a function of the discount rate. Higher inflation reduces the value of bonds outstanding, meaning that less bonds need to be issued today to finance maturing bonds. Nominal money creation, delta M, is viewed as seniorage income from the government's consolidated budget constraint. of course, the more seniorage income, the less bonds the fiscus needs to issue. Taxes are a function of outstanding bonds. So we have a tax rule here with the parameter psi b calibrated to be larger than rho to ensure that the debt ratio converges to its long run target. And finally, I assume that government spending evolves according to a simple AR1 process, and an exogenous shock to government spending, this var epsilon term here, this exogenous shock represents the fiscal stimulus. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are two ways in which the fiscal stimulus can be financed, which determines the monetary policy reaction function. Under the benchmark debt financing regime, additional bonds have to be issued, while I assume that the inflation targeting central bank follows the standard Taylor rule of this form, equation 4. Equation 5, under the monetary financing regime, is nothing but the bond supply rule that we've discussed earlier, where bonds and taxes are set equal to 0 and solved for delta M. And this is what we are left with. Under debt financing, therefore, the money stock adjusts endogenously to support the interest rate required to stabilize inflation and output, whereas under money financing, the interest rate adjusts to support the necessary money creation to finance the fiscal stimulus.
Sorry, Cobus.
Yes, Nicola.
In the money finance, what is there a rule for the fiscal policy? So who stabilizes the economy when you have money financing? So you have a rule on the fiscal. So what determines the fiscal?
I think the fiscal rule is they're determined by setting B and T equal to 0. So you're not issuing bonds and you're not raising taxes. So I guess you can interpret that as the fiscal rule.
But how is the model converging? Okay, is then that rule stable from the point of view of how the economy responds to shocks?
Yeah, the model doesn't explode. So the model can still solve. I'm not sure if it's empirically quite accurate. Mm-hmm. But this is sort of
also technically, why, how that, because we know the new Keynesian model, they need a monetary policy rule.
Yeah.
Yeah. Therefore, you need some feedback rule that brings.
Yeah. So sorry, keep going.
Yeah. Go on. Yeah. You understand what I mean. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think the rule under the monetary financing regime is this equation here. So you essentially have a money growth rule instead of an inflation targeting rule. But if you want, we can discuss the technicalities maybe afterwards.
Okay.
The model does solve, so I think it's okay. And I mean, it was good enough for Gali and it was good enough for the JME. So I didn't think too much on it, to be honest.
Yeah, but where is the trick? I couldn't find it in the Gali paper. Maybe you knew where the trick was.
But the trick is magic money.
Yeah. Okay.
But I guess there are some restriction. I mean, to have this stability, possibly there will be some restriction on the B in the money growth rule to ensure something. Is that some restriction there?
This B, I think that you're referring to, is the target debt ratio. And I have played around I've been doing some sensitivity analyses. And the model does change quite a bit when you calibrate B to be a different debt ratio.
Yeah, I think
that might be the crucial thing that causes the model to converge and solve in the end. So there might perhaps be a scenario under which your target debt ratio is either much too high or much too low, which would prevent the model from solving. And then you kind of have an answer as well, because you know if that's your sort of your fiscal outlook, this policy is not even an option. But that's certainly something to consider.
Yeah. And then the second thing is also related to the question of Nicolas. Possibly there might be some technicality to have, to control. I think if this control of inflation is not explicit in the model, there may be some instability, but maybe it depends on other things in the model that prevent this to happen. But indeed, maybe when you control the debt by your parameter, steady state debt, maybe it's already helping to be in some region. Yeah.
Hilton, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Cobus. Yeah, very
Hello,
interesting so far. Is this a real growth, real money growth on the left-hand side or nominal?
This is nominal. You mean this delta M term?
Is it? And the G
Yeah.
is?
The G is the government spending, which
that'll
we
be
get
real.
from this equation.
But is that real government spending or?
That's a good question.
Because that okay, well, that just makes a lot of difference. So some of the monetary rules are often assumed to be real money because the price level is otherwise indeterminate. And I assume you have a money demand equation because you have money in utility. In I think you might want to check if in the Gali model it's defined as real money or nominal.
No, it is nominal.
It's certainly nominal.
Okay,
yeah,
it is nominal.
Yeah, because that's
the whole model is nominal.
Okay, because that's good. Because if the central bank is targeting real money, it makes a big difference versus they're actually only in control of the supply of nominal. So there are models that overlook this, and there's a big difference in the results. And then I assume that here, I mean, this is the question. Romain went on to it, but that's what stood out to me is that your rule is also including the financing of the debt servicing costs. And my first response would have been setting, or removing that, and to say, the monetary financing is specifically for the government spending. But then you mentioned that the model might not solve then. So it seems like that could be the trick, Mikuda. But
yeah,
I would like to, maybe something interesting to just check, because it's slightly different, right? Because M is going to have an impact on inflation. Inflation's rising with M, then that will also reduce the servicing costs. So then the M then will be less than what's needed. And I have some other things, but I'll wait till the end.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay.
That, yeah.
So thank you for waiting until the end to make sure that we get to the end. Yeah, there is a money demand function in the model and in my code. I didn't put it here. I just wanted to show some of the high level equations here. And as you can see, it is kind of all the standard New Keynesian textbook equations. And in a large extent, this is identical to Gali's model. The parameters are also calibrated from the general DSGE literature, Gali's paper, and then also previous estimations for the South African economy. In my paper, I performed some sensitivity analyses on aspects such as the duration of the fiscal stimulus program and degree of fiscal space and the speed of debt repayment. Sorry, my phone is buzzing. But I'm not going to get into those here because I don't think there's enough time. Now, this is the interesting slide, and this is the benchmark analysis. The red line is the monetary financing regime, and the blue line is the debt financing regime. Now, the shock is calibrated to hypothetically double government expenditure, although the size of the shock is of less interest than the relative dynamics between the two regimes. The results are qualitatively similar to those of Gali, albeit based on a variant of his model and calibrated to the South African economy. Excuse me, I've been a bit sick these past few days and my voice is going. I hope it lasts for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Now, at first glance, the model illustrates the obvious trade-off between the two financing regimes. Monetary financing implies higher inflation and a permanent and significantly higher price level. While debt financing would require an increase in debt, which is this panel here, measured by the number of bonds out, or the value of bonds outstanding, and taxes. Under both regimes, the stimulus is inflationary, but under monetary financing, inflation and the price level are much higher than under debt financing. Conversely, taxes and government debt have to increase under debt financing, with a notable impact on the debt to GDP ratio. Under monetary financing, there's obviously no changes to taxes and debt, and the debt to GDP ratio actually falls as a result of the increase in output. Monetary policy is accommodative under monetary financing, but not under debt financing, as can be seen by the contrasting behavior between the money supply and the nominal interest rate under the two regimes. Under debt financing, the central bank is still targeting inflation through the Taylor rule. The fiscal stimulus is thus countered by an endogenous monetary tightening, illustrated by an increase in the policy rate and a contraction in the money supply. This subsequently constrains consumption, even though the real interest rate falls ever so slightly. Of course, the additional bonds issued by the government also has to be purchased by the household, leaving them with less for discretionary spending. Under monetary financing, however, the central bank is no longer targeting inflation, but instead has to ensure an increase in the money supply to match the fiscal stimulus, which causes a fall in the policy rate. So in addition to the fiscal stimulus, the ultra-loose monetary policy and the fall in the real interest rate also lead to an increase in consumption. Consumers are also not expecting future tax increases, and I'll talk a bit more on recording equivalence below. The net effect is that the output multiplier is much bigger under monetary financing. In fact, it's bigger than 1 under monetary financing and smaller than 1 under debt financing. And this, I guess, ties into some of the discussions we've had earlier today. And this result is consistent with one of Ghali's main results, and also Cristiano and others' results, that fiscal multipliers are generally less than 1 when the zero lower bound is not binding. So under the debt financing regime, the fiscal stimulus is fully financed by bond issuance. This implies that there's a definite upper bound to the size of the fiscal stimulus under a debt financing regime, based on the fiscal space available to accrue additional government debt. Conversely, the upper bound of the stimulus under the monetary financing regime is the amount of additional inflation the consolidated government is willing to accept. Monetary financing is therefore expansionary as long as the money is productively spent in order to generate future growth and tax revenue. But if you tell politicians that there's a limitless pot of money they can spend, all the spending will certainly not be on productive enterprises. In fact, politicians around the world have found ways to misappropriate and waste funds even in comparatively lean times. This model explicitly assumes that the additional government spending is productive and fully contributes to output. Yeah. But what about credibility? Inflation targeting hinges on the central bank's credible commitment to obviously targeting inflation. But here we have imposed 2 different monetary policy reaction functions. Under debt financing, the central bank targets inflation, whereas under monetary financing, it has to target money growth to finance the fiscal stimulus. So how then can an inflation targeting central bank credibly commit to monetary financing? And this is where it kind of gets a bit fluffy. And where maybe where the magic wand of magic money is doing its work. So let's for a minute consider the perspective of households when making their consumption decisions after the initial fiscal stimulus. Under debt financing, if recording equivalence holds, it doesn't matter if government spending is financed by current or future taxes. It will not change the consumption component of aggregate demand. Consumers will anticipate that they will have to pay higher taxes sometime in the future, and therefore they will save rather than spend in anticipation thereof, leaving demand unchanged, or at least consumption demand unchanged. And we can see this in the simulation above. Consumption falls, partially offsetting the fiscal stimulus effect on aggregate output. And this is despite a decrease, albeit a very small one, in the real interest rate. So we have Ricardian households who are cutting back on consumption today in anticipation of future tax increases under the debt financing regime. Monetary financing could see a similar equivalent hypothesis or equivalence hypothesis, and Adair Turner has written quite a bit on this. If consumers believe that the cost of today's government spending is higher inflation in future, or an inflation tax that's coming, they may spend less today and save for the future when their purchasing power will inevitably fall and they will need more money, more cash. Similar to the Ricardian equivalence hypothesis, therefore, there would be little or no impact on aggregate demand, consumption demand at least. But it's more likely that there's a symmetric non-equivalent hypothesis under monetary financing. If consumers believe that the cost of today's government spending is higher inflation in future, they would spend more today while their purchasing power is still relatively high. And the model seemingly supports the latter, where we see a very pronounced consumption effect early on in the following the fiscal stimulus. However, if the anticipation of future inflation does not exist, the expected real interest rates will not fall, and consumers will have no incentive to change their consumption decision today. And there's a bit of a paradox here. Monetary financing can increase consumption today by convincing households that inflation is coming, but no inflation targeting central bank can credibly commit to this. And this is a thought that I need to flesh out a bit more, and there may also be an interesting game theory application of this problem. But this is, of course, not the only way in which monetary financing convinces people to spend. The opposite can also hold true, because even if people do not believe that inflation is coming, they may be fooled to believe that the increase in the money supply represents an increase in their real wealth. So either way, a money-financed fiscal stimulus would always increase consumption. And I think Willem Buiter made the same argument. Helicopter money works always. And then, and then he lists a few conditions which are required for it to work. But in any case, money-financed fiscal stimulus would always increase consumption spending and nominal demand, but there might be a cost of eroding the central bank's credibility. And this is a very difficult thing to capture in a DSGE model. Ghali's model, I think, implicitly assumes that the central bank remains credible and that the monetary financing policy is only temporary. However, as we've seen above, monetary financing central bank is forced to give up the Taylor rule in order to finance the government expenditure. Immediately, therefore, the central bank can no longer target inflation. If economic agents know that the central bank's objective is not price stability, the central bank would start losing its credibility with respect to containing inflation. The higher the persistence of the central bank's monetary financing program, the more pronounced its effect on inflation and the price level will be. Now, this is a result from the sensitivity analysis I did in the paper, but I didn't show it here to save a bit of time. But the point is, if economic agents start doubting the central bank's commitment to long-term price stability, perhaps in favor of a new goal of a fiscal debt target or a money growth target, and observe that the central bank's actions in itself are in itself inflationary, inflation can possibly spiral out of control. So one tentative way, which I tried to introduce a loss in central bank credibility into the model, would be to index inflation backwards. And now I'm sort of moving away from what Ghali was doing, and I'm trying to add and contribute to the model. Excessive past debt monetization could create the expectation that the central bank will simply continue in this vein. For this reason, past inflationary experiences should factor into current price setting decisions. And this would give rise to a backward-looking inflation-augmented Phillips curve. In the figure below, price indexation is calibrated to 0.25, in line with Rudy Steinbach and his co-authors' estimations for South Africa, and compared to the baseline specification without price indexation. So here we have the red line is the baseline scenario or simulation under monetary financing. The blue line is if there's a small price indexation component built into the model. So under either financing regime, money or debt, price indexation has the obvious effect of increasing the inflationary impact of a fiscal stimulus. However, the difference is much more pronounced under the monetary financing regime than under the debt financing regime. And I only show the monetary financing one. The debt financing one is in the paper. Even a mild indexation parameter almost doubles the inflationary impact of the same stimulus. And this is inflation year on year. And you can see the massive difference in the relative difference in the price level as well. The higher the degree of price indexation, the more accommodative the central bank's monetary financing stance is required to be to finance the same fiscal stimulus. This, I think, is evidenced by the higher money supply and stronger policy rate response. And this might be because money has lost some of its purchasing power in the past, and agents now know this. So for the same spending effect, nominal money creation has to be larger. And the longer this continues, monetary easing would likely need to be ever larger in order to finance the same fiscal stimulus. But I mean, there's a lot of thinking to be done here, and especially considering the relationship between nominal and real variables. So it's not quite as simple. Let me start wrapping up. The model is certainly not conclusive evidence that monetary financing is economically feasible or desirable. It does, however, go some way in attaching a quantitative and analytical component to a problem which is to date been discussed in rather imprecise terms. The suggested virtues of monetary financing, no need for debt or taxes, at a seemingly innocuous cost to inflation, which also does not seem to harm consumption or output down the line, are identified here. There's no future monetary tightening because the central bank is not committed to price stability. However, I acknowledge that the model is a gross oversimplification of a very complex question, and in my view, represents perhaps a best case perspective. The model is overly simplistic in that, for one, it only considers short-term bonds, thus there's no rule for the term structure or the exchange of long-term debt for short-term money liabilities. One-period bonds also abstract away from questions around coupon payments and the government essentially making interest payments to itself. It also doesn't include a banking sector, and it implies that the money stock in the model is equivalent to the monetary base and not a broader monetary aggregate akin to today's fractional reserve banking system, where the money supply is in fact a large multiple of the monetary base. If we were to have inflation linked to the broad money supply rather than just the monetary base, inflationary outcomes may well be amplified. It also assumes, the model also assumes, a very simple relationship between the nominal interest rate and the money supply. And this is a critique pointed out by Claudio Borio of the BIS, among others. And I guess once these considerations are taken into account, the picture could look decidedly less rosy. In addition to tightening some of the liberal assumptions made above in this model and in Ghali's model, I want to try to extend this model to consider endogenous price indexation. As I argued earlier, the more the central bank engages in monetary financing, the more their credibility will be eroded. Here I assume the constant price indexation parameter, but there is some literature that finds empirical evidence in favor of time variation in wage and price indexation. The model could therefore perhaps be expanded to endogenous price indexation as some function of the frequency or degree to which the central bank monetizes government spending. And this may then be interpreted as the inverse of the central bank's stock of credibility, which, as it is eroded, exacerbates the inflationary effects of monetization. Now, having acknowledged the shortcomings of the model, is the model still useful? A richer model may well allow us to perform more quantitative analyses, for example, welfare or optimal policy analysis. But this simple model confirms many of our priors. Monetary financing does not require the government to take on additional debt or raise higher taxes. Monetary financing can have higher output multipliers than debt financing. And the cost of monetary financing is significantly higher inflation relative to debt financing. So the attraction of monetary financing and the commensurate attention it has recently enjoyed in the popular press, as well as the revived academic discourse, is perhaps justifiable for countries with a combination of high debt levels, low inflation, and low interest rates. And this includes many developed economies around the world. The possibility of reflating the economy without the need to increase government indebtedness, while at the same time stimulating output without relying on the policy interest rate, sounds almost too good to be true. And developing economies are attracted to the idea for the same reasons. However, I fear while developing economies in general, arguably enjoy less fiscal space than developed economies, their generally structurally higher inflation rates could make the additional inflationary cost of such policies prohibitive. And conversely, with interest rates generally higher in developing economies, they have more monetary policy space to pursue conventional stimulus. Is this feasible for South Africa? Now, as I've argued so far, I think the simple model presents a rather optimistic view of a money financing regime. And I don't think this would be an appropriate strategy for South Africa for the following reasons. Is there a question or a comment?
There is, yeah, maybe if you go to the end, if you could just go to the end. There is questions coming.
Okay, this is pretty much the end. This is
Okay.
the last slide. I just want to say why I don't think South Africa is a candidate for monetary financing. First, South Africa is not, inflation is not undershooting its target, and we're not in a deflationary environment. I think the low inflation we saw last year was transitory and the result of lockdown policies. Secondly, our real interest rates have remained positive. So there is still room for conventional monetary stimulus through reductions in the policy rate. I should, however, acknowledge the relatively high inflation figures that came out for the last month or two, 5.2% for May and 4.4% for April of this year. But I think that reflects the very low base CPI from which the calculation was made because of the lockdown policies last year when the economy essentially stood still. Price indexation in South Africa is not trivial. So the inflationary effect of monetization policies, I fear, will be exacerbated. Something that's not always fully appreciated in the MMT debate is the importance of monetary sovereignty. South Africa has significant dollar-denominated and other external debt, which cannot be paid off by printing rands. In reality, actually, very few economies have true monetary sovereignty. Most developing economies have some kind of dollar or foreign currency debt. And the Eurozone economies are, of course, unable to issue their own currencies. Finally, government spending, especially over the last decade or so, was extremely unproductive. And this would be a critique of debt financing as well. Roy pointed out yesterday that the composition of our government spending is not growth enhancing. So we're likely to see a lot of money flowing into the economy with little commensurate, productive, and growth enhancing spending from the government. Additional cash may well boost consumption spending and thereby output. Could the central bank have used monetary financing as a first response to the COVID shock? Perhaps yes. I have a section on this which I'll try to condense very quickly. I realize the time is running out. Hindsight is, of course, 2020, if you'll excuse the terrible pun, but there might have been justification for the central bank, or the government at least, issuing COVID bonds and the central bank just buying that up to facilitate a massive investment in hospital beds and care facilities and oxygen supplies. But it should also be acknowledged that many of these resources were also hard to come by due to insufficient supply and productive capacity. And Michael yesterday also alluded to the shortages of nurses in this time, which is a case in point. The reality is that you cannot spend yourself out of supply constraints. And I think that's a key message that we should have, that we should take note of in the South African context. Eskom, no, definitely not. I think there was a comment on the chat yesterday or the day before asking about Eskom and the central bank. I don't recall exactly what was said. But the Reserve Bank cannot simply bail out, for example, Eskom, as its problems are largely self-inflicted, and it's not due to a massive exogenous shock like a virus pandemic or a war. The moral hazard implication of such a policy would be that all failed SOEs and municipalities will then expect the same assistance instead of getting their own houses in order. And I think we urgently need to create a culture of accountability across our institutions. But that's a topic for another day, and I think we can talk on that for a week. My final thought is a thought that's not mine. I read it on a blog somewhere, not a blog. Money can always be printed, but credibility cannot. We cannot simply throw money at every problem, and we cannot purchase things that do not exist. On Monday, Eric referred to the fragility of credibility and trust in government debt and the central bank, which I think sums up this discussion very well. Over the past 20 years, the Reserve Bank has built up excellent credibility, and they've resolutely stuck to their price stability mandate, despite significant and increasing political pressure. In my view, maintaining price stability is arguably the most important socio-economic contribution the central bank can make in a society where millions of citizens earn little to no income. Magic money, I fear, is not the answer. We cannot inflate away our foreign debt, and we cannot outspend our supply side constraints. I will leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay. Questions? Romain?
I think Hilton was first.
Okay, Hilton.
Yeah.
Thanks, Romain. You didn't need to, but thank you. Cobus, thanks. Very interesting presentation. Yeah, totally agree with the views. So let me just talk about the model and the results. So one, I think it would help with the exposition and also getting at some of the nuances in your impulse responses. So essentially, in the monetary financing scenario, fiscal policy and monetary policy are coordinating in the same direction. Whereas in your debt financing scenario, right, then they endogenously respond by, and then that's contractionary. Yeah. So I would suggest, I mean, you've got, that's fine. I mean, that's the regimes that you choosing between. But I think it would be useful to turn off the endogenous response of monetary policy in that Taylor rule. And so you get the, in a sense, the pure debt financed stimulus effect without the endogenous response of monetary policy, because a lot of your context is talking about the low interest rate environment that we're currently in. I mean, which leads into, you know, some of the current debate, which we can, I'm not going to go into now. And then the other thing is...
Why not? We've got time.
Because we don't have time.
We don't have time. I'll talk for hours. Then the other thing, which is Borio's spot on, I totally agree. I think the majority of macro models miss this when they're looking at money growth rules. Let's just call that your rule. And in interest rates, that the link on the supply side between money and interest rates. And again, this should be nominal. There are simple ways to do this. I did this in the recent paper I published. I can send it to you in macrodynamics. So this was the idea. The exact idea was to try and, I mean, to the extent that the money multiplier remains constant or not, it's a theoretical model, so it's fine. You can assume the money multiplier is constant, so you're not worried about the endogenous money story, which is legitimate.
All right.
As a starting point. So I think getting that link is correct, because you want the feedback mechanism, because when the central bank is printing money, there's no direct effect on the interest rate, and for the Taylor rule for that matter. You know, when the interest rate's changing, it's not having a direct effect on money. It's only affecting money through the money demand function of the household and your consolidated government budget balance. And so essentially in that world, money is just matching commensurate to whatever the price level needs to be. And that's why you get that jump in the price level. Money will jump to meet that, to the extent that sticky prices stop, right? So if you turned your model into a flexible price model, you would get nothing.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, I mean, that's the key point. And
yeah, that's one of the key results from Ghali's paper as well, that the price stickiness is crucial to generating these effects. Yeah,
exactly. So I will share that other paper, and I just think for the coordination, you know, you must try to strip out that endogenous monetary policy response. So you more like comparing apples to apples. What's the direct stimulatory effect from debt versus monetary financing? Might make it clearer.
That's good. Thanks.
Yeah.
Romain?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nicolas. Thanks, Cobus, for your nice presentation. Yes, I think indeed with the public debate about what to do with debt or stimulating the economy, yeah, there is a temptation indeed to think about this instrument, about money financing. But I think I agree with your conclusion that possibly this is not consistent in the South African context, right? To apply this rule because there is no deflation, there is no structural deflation, and then my question is, why then you use, you know, you are trying to do this? I don't know. Maybe something you want to explain, because in the first place, it's not something that applies for South Africa. And then my follow-up question will be then, maybe I missed that in your nice presentation, but what is specific in your analysis to South Africa when you are applying the model? So possibly what I will have done, maybe to make the analysis, I think, fit to explain something South Africa could be possibly to try to just estimate the shock, because you have all several parameters. Why don't you try to start to estimate the shocks and then see now how the model is going to perform? And this comes back to one point Nicola made, which is quite important. I think now the only thing comparison you are doing is multiply, right? You say multiply the two regimes, but there are other considerations about stabilizing the economy. So suppose that you were to respond to other macroeconomic shocks, right? Like productivity shocks or demand shock. How would you perform in the two model and then bring everything back to the welfare? And then you understand. So that will make maybe your analysis also, I think, more fit to the case of South Africa in the reality, according to me. Otherwise, I think the analysis, I think it's a big debate, especially if you are in a deflation, right? Like in the case of Japan or in some country in the Europe where, there is this debate that there is not a big deal. And finally, I think Hilton is right. It's also about this money multiply. All depend on this as well. That is very crucial. I think in the whole debate about money.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is these are my
thank you. I'll quickly respond, and then I know Michelle is waiting to start presentation as well. I think the why do I even do it here is to kind of address the political debate. And most of us, I think, are economists and not politicians, but economics is almost always politics, and there are politicians and economists who are strongly in favor of such kind of policies for South Africa. And this we can also go into for a whole week. So I'm trying to kind of speak to that debate with the help of a very simple model. I take your points on the estimation of the model and testing testing the different shocks. This is really, I guess, just a starting point to get the debate going and get the conversation going. And there's a lot of work that I can do on this model to make it more robust and to actually make it more valuable and worthwhile. But thank you for your comments, and thank you, Hilton, as well. And thank you for giving me the time, Nicola and Romain.
Thank you, Cobus. Thank you very much.